Hello, and welcome to our special Grand Rounds today, our special Distinguished Visiting Lecture Grand Rounds. We have the wonderful privilege of having Dr. Claire Gillan come and address us today. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about her background and why what she's doing is so interesting and important for psychiatry and is part of an ongoing conversation that really started when David Reddish first gave us a Grand Rounds back in February about computational psychiatry and about these sort of novel ways of thinking about what might be a new way of conceptualizing pathologies in psychiatric illnesses and therefore a new way of trying to study and understand these pathologies. Claire is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Trinity College Institute of Neuroscience and the Global Brain Health Institute at Trinity College, Dublin. She was also a Sir Henry Wellcome postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychology at NYU, where she worked with Nathaniel Daw and Elizabeth Phelps, and also the University of Cambridge, where she worked with Trevor Robbins. And actually, she received her PhD from the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge, working with Trevor Robbins and Barbara Sahakian. And for some of you may know, really, in a sense, pillars, giants in the field of neuroscience-informed research in serious mental illnesses. Claire's work has contributed particularly in ways, as I was sort of alluding to earlier, of thinking about how are novel ways to measure changes, if you will, or abnormalities, if we want to consider it that way, of information flow in the brain and the nervous system. What's another way of thinking about phenotypes in psychiatric illnesses, and really trying to understand it from the perspective of what is the nervous system doing adaptively or maybe not so adaptively in terms of how it's representing information and using that information to guide decision making. And in particular, she's focused on obsessive-compulsive disorder and the obsessive-compulsive spectrum, and on the balance or the tension between habit learning systems and more model-based learning systems. And these are principles which can be applied trans-diagnostically to really enlarge our understanding of kind of human condition, human behavior. And so we'll turn it over to Claire to learn more about these approaches. And I can sort of whet everyone's appetite by saying I think this is the beginning. Also some new similar kinds of approaches you're going to be seeing us taking in various corners of the department and various aspects of not just our research but our clinical enterprise as well. So this is a great introduction to that new direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and I'm really delighted to be here, and thanks all of you for taking the time to show up and listen to me go on today. There's not much to show here in terms of disclosures, and I'm going to start by talking about really basic principles. And that is that when we try and understand mental health and when we try and treat mental health, really what we're faced with in the clinic is suffering, this kind of nebulous and very broad term, right? We've got people who can't leave the home because their anxiety is so great, people who won't eat even though they're starving, people who can't get through the day without having a drink, people who, check their drawer for whether their knives are there repeatedly, and so on and so on and so on. And it's this very complicated space of health that really is often very individual to the patient that you might see in a given setting. So what do we do with this really complicated space? Well, we try and simplify it. We try and make the problem tractable, something that we can understand, and something that we can try and start to parse at a biological level and gain insights from. And that's really, what we've been doing in mental health for quite a while. So what we do is we classify people into different categories based usually on the symptoms that are the most prominent or the symptoms that are maybe the most destructive. And we end up with things like OCD, schizophrenia, depression, social anxiety. And the model that kind of follows from this, moving into kind of the researcher model, is what we end up doing is then kind of picking our favorite disorder and then trying, kind of getting burrowed more and more down that track and trying to understand the phenomenology and try and, understand the causes of that particular syndrome. And this is certainly where I started, and OCD is my favorite disorder. And the way that I kind of approached it was when I started, and I'm going to kind of take you on a bit of a narrative from my PhD work to where I am now, was really know anything about OCD, and I was kind of tasked with this difficult job of trying to understand what causes it. And so at the time, the field was dominated by this view that OCD was kind of a disorder of faulty belief, and that patients thought all these kind of crazy things about how the world worked, and that caused them to experience a lot of anxiety, like they thought dangers were more imminent than they were, more pressing than they were. It causes them anxieties, which caused them then to perform these kind of compulsive behaviors as a way to mitigate the risk, or a way to avoid these bad things from happening. So the idea might be that OCD patients think that it's really likely you can get HIV from a toilet seat or something, and it causes them to perform these compulsive behaviors over and over again as almost a rational response to an irrational belief that's kind of driving the disorder. So when I started meeting patients, trying to initially recruit them, but also trying to learn about what made these people tick, and trying to understand the phenomenology day to day, I noticed some kind of issues with this classic view of OCD, and it comes down to this fundamental of insight, which is one that psychiatrists are interested in lots of disorders, but it was kind of very evident in the case of OCD. And what's the most frustrating thing about OCD is that patients who suffer from it know, just like you and I do, that washing their hands 10 times doesn't make a bit of difference from washing them 1 time. And it's that knowledge, right, that loss of control over the behavior that you're doing, despite all of the available evidence, that makes OCD just so frustrating to try and manage as a patient. So we see this as kind of a separation between insight, between knowing that your behavior is really senseless, and not being able to stop doing it or repeating it over and over again. And this is something that we really wanted to try and understand as we met patients who could very cogently describe the irrationality of their own behavior. So the way that we try to understand this, as has been foreshadowed, is in terms of the balance between 2 systems, and we call these goal-directed and habitual in the brain. And the very simple idea, at least that we started with, is that there's an imbalance such that patients with OCD are more likely to get caught in repetitive habits at the expense of something called goal-directed control. And these are kind of buzzwords, and I'm going to go through their definition in operational terms to hopefully bring it home, as this will be a theme throughout the talk. So the distinction between these 2 modes of action selection, so habits being kind of repetitive, automatic behaviors, and goal-directed, as the name suggests, being more purposeful, planned, future-oriented behaviors. The distinction was first operationalized by a guy called Chris Adams in Cambridge in the early 80s. And what he did was he trained a rat to press a lever, and he would reward those lever presses with a sweet treat that the rats liked very much. And he would have the rats do this over and over again for a long period of time, and then he would let the rats just eat those sucrose pellets for free. So he'd let him eat as many as he wanted, but unfortunately, or as cruel as he was, he would pair the consumption of these food pellets with an injection of lithium chloride. And what that does is it makes the rat very sick, and in doing so, it induces a very reliable taste aversion to those food pellets. And rats are biologically prepared to be very good at learning these taste aversions for survival in the wild. So what this amounts to, or what we call this kind of procedure, is a devaluation. And it's called that because what we're doing is we're reducing the rat's motivation for the food source that was previously enjoyable to him. And this works very well. If you put the rats, back in a chamber, give them free access to the foods, they'll no longer consume this food because they've learned that it's kind of bad for them. So the simple question that Adams wanted to ask was, well, what happens if you present this rat with the lever that you had trained him on initially? Is he going to keep pressing that lever as though nothing happened, even though he no longer wants the outcome that's associated with that reward? And if he does, then we say his behavior is habitual, right? It's driven by the presentation of this lever, causes them to automatically respond, be damned the other, features of this particular decision space. He's done this in the past, it's automatically triggered. But there's another thing the rat can do, or could do in this situation, and that's update their behavioral repertoire now. They could now ignore that lever because they know that, pressing it, what's the point? I don't want the outcome that lever produces. And if the rat now, after this devaluation procedure, decides to no longer press this lever, then we say his behavior is goal-directed. And that means that the actions he's performing is directly linked to the consequences that the rat wants at that moment. And this sounds very, higher order and maybe fanciful when you're thinking about a rodent model, and I'll show you the data that may surprise some of you. So what Adams showed back in the 80s was that, to many people's surprise, rats are indeed capable of showing this kind of complex goal-directed behavior. So what we're showing here is lever presses per minute, where rats in the valued group are responding more than rats who've had this food outcome devalued. So they're capable of reducing responding in light of a motivational change. But more interestingly for today's purposes, he also showed that if you overtrain those rats, if you give them 5 times the amount of training, then this sensitivity to devaluation goes away, and the rats are now habitual, right? They're performing these kind of stereotyped stimulus response behaviors with disregard for the consequences. So this is the kind of first way that the balance between these systems was defined, and there's been lots of studies doing this in rodents. And what we did in my PhD was translate this into human work. And in particular, we wanted to probe the balance between goals and habits in OCD patients. I'm not going to go through some of these. I'm just going to present kind of results rather than designs, and this is like just setting up kind of one of the results. So when we translate this kind of paradigm to humans with OCD patients in white and controls in gray, you can see that they're performing just like Adam's overtrained rats, right? So the difference between their responding to valued and devalued stimuli is a lot less than healthy control subjects. So they're more likely, once we've trained them, to keep responding on a lever, even though they no longer want the outcome of their actions. And there are various kind of controls that we employ in these settings you can ask about later. But we really do match, motivation and knowledge and all these things quite well. In some respects, and I'll talk to you about some of the wrinkles there as we go on. So this was the first evidence that showed that OCD patients in a 25-minute laboratory experiment are more likely to form a habit than healthy controls who don't have OCD. And this was done, in a task that had absolutely nothing to do with the symptoms that patients presented with. These guys were, responding left and right in a button to earn pictures of fruit and money eventually. It was very symbolic. So again, starting to hint at the idea that, in the absence of any potential for obsessional thought, we see this basic behavioral tendency to form habits in these patients. But it's not fully satisfying, right? Because we can start looking at compulsive behavior in OCD and say that maybe it's a product of, this imbalance in the habit system. But another, fundamental truth is that patients with OCD, the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority also have anxiety and obsessive thoughts present. So what we wanted to try and understand was how those things might interact with the dysfunctional habit system and, playing devil's advocate, try and address some competing ideas that, maybe at some level that we can't measure very well, maybe faulty beliefs are driving these habit biases even in our what seem like tightly controlled experimental settings. So we did this by looking at habits in the context of avoidance. And this was interesting to us because it allowed us to study conditioned fear responses as a way to kind of get at anxiety. And it also allowed us to examine beliefs in this kind of fear domain. So the task was quite simple. So previously we were looking at appetitive habits, looking for where people are working for rewards. Here we're looking at avoidance habits, which hadn't been studied before at this time. And so what we had subjects do was initially learn that every time they saw this blue square, they were going to get shocked to their, I think that's their right wrist. That's deterministic. So we're sitting them down, we have them hooked up to these electrical stimulators on both of their wrists. Every time they see this square, they'll get a shock. They'll get a shock to the other wrist if they see the yellow square, and then there's also a safe color and obviously counterbalanced. So we trained subjects on this for a number of trials, and then we introduced an avoidance response that's also deterministic. And I made these graphics a while ago. I apologize for the quality, but this is kind of like a pedal box graphic that we made that would sit between people's feet. So you'd kind of respond on the right side or the left side depending on what you wanted to do in the task. So if you wanted to avoid receiving a shock to your right wrist, you'd press the right side of this foot box, and you could avoid that shock on every single trial. And a lot of patients did, and most subjects did very quickly. These are very simple associations to learn. And you can see they're consistent with the side of the body as well, making it even easier. You respond the left and you avoid the left shock, and then there's no response required here. So all subjects are told in this task is that their goal is to avoid receiving shocks. Okay, so just like in Adam's experiments and in the appetitive experiments I described earlier, after training subjects for a certain amount of time, we're interested in their sensitivity to this kind of devaluation procedure. And, it's a little tricky with shock, but the one we came up with was a simple disconnection procedure. So subjects were sitting there, and they actually were attached initially 2 different electric shock devices at each of their wrists. And what we did for this devaluation phase is we would actually physically disconnect it in front of their, like in their sight, before going on to the next phase of the experiment. So they could see that they could physically no longer receive a shock to that wrist based on this disconnection procedure. To kind of remove any ambiguity, and this is, I understand, quite a contrived experiment, we said to subjects, hey, we've plugged this out, you can no longer be shocked to this wrist, your only task is to avoid the remaining shock. So after, kind of arming everybody with as much weaponry as we could to encourage them to stop responding to what they'd previously learned, we're now going to test how well OCD patients did at, or how likely they were to keep responding even though they could no longer be shocked. And what we found is that, just like in our repetitive paradigm, indeed they were more likely to respond. You can see that overall devaluation is much stronger. Again, we're really slapping people in the face with this devaluation procedure. But again, we get this critical interaction and effect where in OCD, they're more likely to continue pressing despite having these outcomes be devalued and them understanding that. So we were interested, as I said, in the idea that perhaps failures in extinguishing conditioned fear or some other assay of physiological anxiety or fear might drive these effects. We didn't find any evidence of that in both groups. This is skin conductance response, so a measure of physiological arousal. We see that basically all the groups over the course of the experiment habituate to the setting. They're not getting very many shocks at all, and we don't see any differences between the 2 groups. Now, it's a null effect, that's what it is, but we found no evidence, for example, that OCD patients were holding on to any fears from the initial experiment that might be causing them to behave the way they were. And then the final thing we wanted to ask with this study was, how do these habits then relate to beliefs or cognitions, which we know are really important for OCD? And we're kind of interested in this, essentially this kind of chicken and the egg question of which comes first, the compulsive behaviors or the obsessions in OCD in the context of this model. So the way we did it in this experiment was kind of very simple. We asked subjects at the end of the experiment, how likely they thought it was that they could be shocked when they saw the stimulus that predicted the now disconnected electrode. And this is, and so what we found is, there was no significant effect, but you could argue, we had 25 per group, that this might come out if we had a larger sample size. And so what this shows is, if there's no difference, but if you're kind of really harsh, you'll say nominally OCD patients might have had stronger residual beliefs that they could still be shocked, and maybe this on some level contributes to their habit biases. But when we did this experiment, we realized that this was really a confounded time to ask this question. So this was at the end of the experiment, after people had not only experienced the devaluation, but after they'd also performed the habitual behavior or withheld responding, whenever the case may be for the individual. So we're more interested really in the kind of dynamics of how this changes over time and how temporally we can link the beliefs to the formation of the habit, but also the performance of the habit itself. So we did this, I'm cheating now, I'm showing you data from a subsequent study that gets at this issue that I will come back to in a moment. And what we did here was we repeatedly asked subjects to rate their shock expectancy throughout the experiment. We're not super interested in it here. This is during the different blocks of training. This is a very similar task. And at this dotted line, we conducted the devaluation procedure, and then we got another rating of shock expectancy. But what's critical is they hadn't yet gone through this test of habit formation. They hadn't done anything behaviorally. And what you can see here is that both of the groups look the same, right? So you go from, about, let's say, 90% certainty that you're going to get a shock from the stimulus down to about 20%, or maybe 25%, 30%. So what this tells me is that even healthy people and OCD people alike retain some degree of, doubt or uncertainty in this kind of paradigm. Even though it's disconnected, they're still not 100% sure, what's going on. They've got this kind of experimenter giving them electric shocks. They're confused and afraid. But at this point, there's no difference between the 2 groups. Disconnection of the electrode. So it's really interesting, I think, and something that we're trying to push on now is really what happens after the performance of the habit itself. And so, I'm sorry this is kind of small, but so this time period here is the same as this time period here from the other experiment. And what you can see is, if you follow the blue line, healthy controls have this normal level of uncertainty or doubt, then they do not perform the habit. their natural irrational beliefs or their natural residual doubt fades away by virtue of them sitting there and experiencing the lack of shock and all these other things that one would experience in this kind of setting. Whereas the OCD patients perform the habits during the tests, and what started out as regular old irrational beliefs that pop into all of our heads maintain, right? They don't have the opportunity to dissolve with the, with the passage of time like you might have, in the healthy control group. So I think this is interesting. The way we think about it is certainly we don't seem to have evidence that there's irrational beliefs before the devaluation tests that are driving patients to perform in a certain way. But I think there's scope for thinking that, normal levels of intrusive thoughts or irrational beliefs are perpetuated by the performance of habits and not given the opportunity to extinguish as they might otherwise. Okay, so I'm going to close on this little piece about the prior work. With a quick summary. So OCD patients get stuck in habits. We've shown this in a couple of different paradigms that I briefly mentioned, but it doesn't tell us too much about the mechanism behind it. And as I've had in some conversations this morning, one of the questions that these paradigms beg is what we're seeing a deficit in goal-directed learning, or is it an enhancement in the formation of stimulus response habits? Which of these things is driving patients to kind of essentially fail on these devaluation tests? So the way we answer this was by turning to brain imaging while doing one of these avoidance habit paradigms and drawing on a wealth of wonderful data from animal models. And I know there's a big drive here at the moment to really try and link up across 3 different species. I think this is an example of a great success story in that regard. So a wealth of data from optogenetic work in rats, or in mice, or lesion studies in rats, human MRI, you name it, have converged on the importance of the putamen or the dorsolateral striatum in the rodent for the formation of stimulus response habits, and that's dissociated nicely from the contribution of the caudate and the orbitofrontal cortex in this kind of prospective goal-directed planning, in linking actions to their consequences, etc. And a similarly beautiful cross-species model has emerged here. So we were interested in looking at patients while they formed the avoidance paradigm, and this is the third graph I'm showing you here. This is the most recent paper that we did. We kind of optimized the avoidance task a little bit and the effects a bit stronger. So we're interested in looking at those patients who who had developed habits at this given moment in time and trying to associate with that with dysfunctional activity in circuits that may overlap with these regions that we've shown, that other studies have shown to be important in the 2 competing hypotheses. And kind of long story short, what we find is that habit biases in OCD patients are linked to hyperactivity of the caudate nucleus, which is not only important for goal-directed control and linking actions to outcomes, but has been really consistently linked to OCD in the context of symptom provocation exacerbates what's already a baseline high level of activity in this region, and we know that it improves with successful treatment with SSRIs and behavioral therapy as well, actually. So anyway, this is kind of like the round out of a body of work I did during my PhD, and it gets on these 2 kind of summaries. We think, or we have evidence that they do get stuck in habits in the context of these quite short lab experiments. And we think that this is called by deficits in goal-directed systems. I've only showed you the imaging data as kind of a highlight. We've done several behavioral experiments that converge, I think, quite convincingly on this explanation. But then when it came to moving on and going into my postdoctoral studies, I became kind of obsessed with the idea of, how can we take this further and how can we bring it to a point where we actually have a benefit, a practical benefit for people trying to treat these disorders or people suffering from them. So one of the things, and again, I think this is, from this work, at least myself, certainly, I felt like it was a success story, right? We have a model that makes sense at these different levels. We've got the neuroimaging to back it up. If we can't use this to make a positive change, then really what are we kind of doing here? So one thing I thought that we might be able to do is focus on therapies that boost goal-directed control, be they behavioral or pharmacological, and that this might be one avenue to use these findings to kind of inform treatment options. But then I became kind of not depressed, but confused by a few facets of treatment and heterogeneity within OCD as a category. And so one thing that's kind of overlooked a lot is that, when we treat patients with OCD, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the response. So the first line treatment is with an antidepressant, an SSRI, and some patients will respond, but it's about 50-50 or a little worse in terms of who's going to respond from that as a first line treatment. So that's confusing enough. But it gets more confusing when you start thinking about this broader spectrum of mental health, right? And you think about disorders like depression or different anxiety disorders that also respond to these kind of so it's either disappointing or else it presents kind of a nice opportunity for change or growth in this area, and that's kind of choose the latter. So I've kind of just given a little hint about one feature of heterogeneity within category and one feature of kind of this blurring that goes across categories. But I think if you all, those of you who engage in research, reflect on your own work, the statement that, none of our cognitive models or our genetic models or our neurobiological models hold for one disorder in particular is true, right? And in the vast majority of cases, we also find that models, just like, mine or this one, they hold for more disorders than they do OCD. And so maybe this was really the point of my reawakening or my focus on this topic, when I was very disappointed that papers came out showing goal-directed deficits and other disorders that really don't fit with my model, right? So schizophrenia we can talk about all day. It's it's an interesting and special case in its relation to OCD. But social anxiety disorder, if this is a disorder that does not have compulsive features that we would see associated with OCD, and if we have these kind of deficits in that disorder, then, to me, there's two explanations. So one is the model is really poor and we need to throw it out. It probably holds for all different disorders under the sun. And if that's true, then we're not going to get any closer to specificity. But the other is that, what we're dealing with is the fact that the lines between these different disorder categories are blurred. And if we continue to do research using this kind of paradigm where we look within each different silo, we might not be progressing the field anymore. We're just kind of dealing with this, this noise cloud that blurs across different disorders, and we're missing potential signal. And another way of putting this is that, the disorder categories that we have are not biological realities, and by investing so much in trying to reify each individual category, we might kind of be shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of progress in this area. So this is not a new idea. This is something that has major funding implications in the US, in particular with the NIMH's shift from the classic category-based research to RDoc, and again, is obviously a push that you guys in Minnesota have in terms of moving into a space where we look trans-diagnostically rather than at individual categories. And so this is something that I focused on then in my postdoctoral work. And again, so it's testing this idea that, is this model that I've been working on for 3 or 4 years garbage? Does it have no specificity to anything we care about in mental health? Or is it something that actually tracks an important trans-diagnostic feature of mental health, and maybe that's going to explain some of the blurring that we see, regardless of whether we're psychologists, geneticists, neuroscientists, what have you. Okay, so it's a new area, and when we were starting out, we didn't really know what the criteria should be, so we kind of had a few ideas of what we think a trans-diagnostic psychiatric dimension would look like. And one of them is that we think there's no reason that these things shouldn't be continuous biologically. So looking here, I'm going to use obviously my own model here to give examples here. So we think that the relationship between deficits in the cognitive process should be continuous with symptom severity. There's nothing categorically different about someone who crosses an arbitrary threshold for disease and someone who doesn't, nor is it between someone who is well one week and poor the next. We think these effects should be generalizable. So in this example, we think that failures in goal-directed control are responsible for repetitive compulsive behaviors. And so we should see this in other examples of compulsivity across disorders, and this might explain the blurring that you see when you compare different categories to one another. But the most important, the first two might be easy to meet and have little meaning, and the third, I think, is the most important, and it's one that's the most often overlooked, and that is this model should have specificity. So there should be other aspects of psychiatry that don't have compulsive features that don't show this association. And again, so that's getting beyond the idea of, if we don't meet this criteria, let's say, then we could just be dealing with an epiphenomenon. Anyone with a major disease or stressor could show poor performance of this task, and that's not so interesting. So disorders like anxiety and depression, which we think of as being non-compulsive, if we can parse that, we think there should be no association with this cognitive performance. So looking at this, or how to achieve this, we realized quickly that we can't do this in small samples. In my PhD, it would take 2 years to get 35 patients with OCD. This wasn't going to work. So we turned instead to online testing using a platform I'm sure most of you are familiar with, which is called Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Very briefly, it's a crowdsourcing platform where you can initially, companies would put up market research questions and pay people small amounts of money to answer them. Now you can get fully, interactive, gamified cognitive tests that people will do for you for, 45 minutes or an hour in exchange for pay, and they'll also tell you things about themselves that are relevant clinically. So we use this to test subjects from all across the United States on a task that I think I'm not going to define in any detail, but a task that we've shown measures goal-directed planning and predicts evaluation performance in the way that we would expect given the models that we've looked at before. It's a slightly superior quantitative method of measuring this. So we had almost 2,000 individuals complete this in their homes across the country, 1,400 of which we collected in 10 days. So I told you that number about collecting data from 40 subjects in 2 years. Quite a big improvement. So what we had subjects do was complete this task that took about 25 minutes. We had them complete self-report clinical questionnaires. These are standardized clinical instruments that are designed for self-report. And then we also measured IQ, age, and gender to act as covariates in our analyses. The reason we need the big sample is because we're not comparing one, homogeneous or one group to another. We're looking at fingerprints, essentially. Fingerprints of mental health profiles that we know no two individuals are alike in, right? So we've got individuals who are higher in, depression and trait anxiety, but don't show the same features of OCD, and we've got different combinations across the population. We're going to use all of that fabulous variability to separate these different aspects of psychopathology into dimensions that we think might be more biologically valid, or dimensions that the data determines by itself, as you'll see in a moment. Okay, so we had everyone complete these different questionnaires. There were 9 different questionnaires. We didn't know what we were doing. We first collected data from 500 subjects to see if we could get any reasonable data or if there was any signal that would approximate what we'd seen in these diagnosed patient groups. And we were heartened to learn with this initial pilot that we could, right? And we saw that, so these graphs are a little funny. So what we're looking at here is percentage change in goal-directed learning for every standard deviation increase in what are continuous clinical scales here. So for every standard deviation increase in OCD symptoms, you get a 14% drop in model-based planning or in goal-directed control on this task. And what we found, again, was somewhat heartening also, was that there seemed to be some evidence for some specificity in this. So we didn't see the same effects in depression and anxiety, and these were all in the same subjects. Okay, so it seemed like it was going to work out, so we decided to increase our sample size for a reason that will become evident in a moment, and also increase the spread of psychiatric features that we're measuring in this study. So we had our old favorites, OCD, depression, and trait anxiety, but we also included a bunch of aspects of psychopathology that have been theorized to be compulsive in the literature. And these include aspects of eating disorders, in particular binging behavior has been linked to these goal-directed deficits, binging and purging to some extent, impulsivity, this kind of broadly defined loss of control over behavior, and then, of course, alcohol addiction. And then again, to try and get at this issue of specificity, we included a bunch of other aspects of psychopathology that we think don't have a compulsive component and shouldn't show the same effect. So again, we replicated our effect in OCD, and we found that indeed it did extend to other aspects of psychopathology that have this, theoretical compulsive element. So eating disorders, impulsivity, OCD, and alcohol addiction. And again, we find some evidence that this effect seems to be relatively specific, or that, in broad strokes, our idea or intuitions are right, and we don't see effects coming down the line here. Now, but one thing you'll notice from this is, first of all, obviously, we're seeing a blurring across different categories. We're not seeing an on-off across these different groupings. And also, I'm not going to make any claims about, let's schizotype be here, which is in yellow, which doesn't, cross an arbitrary p less than 0.05 threshold, just because alcohol, addiction does its nearest cousin. Certainly, these are not different from one another. Another thing that's not clear from this approach, and again, I should clarify, this approach is no better than looking at different diagnostic categories and comparing them to one another. And the reason that it's no better is because all of these questionnaires are correlated with one another. And it's something that's kind of overlooked an awful lot when we do these kind of studies. I mean, the most shocking one is depression and anxiety, which correlate at 0.8. So if you're doing a study looking at a correlation with depression symptoms, you've also got an anxiety study on your hands. So we're looking at these overlapping constructs. So what we really want to find out is if there's a trans-diagnostic dimension that explains this blurring and this pattern of results across the different categories. And this is why we needed the big sample, because to do this, and to do this in a data-driven way, we turned to factor analysis, and we looked at the intercorrelation of 209 different questionnaire, self-report questionnaire items. And this is a correlation matrix from that, and what we found was that a three-factor solution best explained these data. This is like a really unhelpful graphic, but I think it looks pretty. So I'm going to rotate it in a minute and make it make sense. So I'm going to rotate this second factor and show you what these different lines mean. So three-factor solution best explain the data, and the one that we're really interested in is this factor 2, which reflects, and I understand it's a long name, compulsive behavior and intrusive thought. And I'll kind of take, I think I'm going to take you on a tour of the different items. But so what this graph shows is each of these bars is an individual questionnaire item. So I said there's 209 of these bars across the screen. The height of the bar tells you how much it contributes to this factor, how important it is for defining compulsive behavior, and the color is just kind of a heuristic you can use to look where that questionnaire, the questionnaire of origin that particular item came from. And you can see that there's quite a lot of heterogeneity within these different questionnaires. And again, this is coming back to the idea that there are these elements, these features of psychiatry that pop through different disorders, and that certainly aren't homogenous within a different, within a specific concept of a disorder. So the items, like the top-loading items that contribute to this factor from eating disorders are items relating to, or an example is binge eating behavior. The items that, load from the impulsive scale, some of which relate to impulse buying and kind of spending more than you earn, shopping addiction related items. We get basically all of the items from OCDs, just repetitive checking is example of them. Consistent, albeit lower loadings from the alcohol dependence questionnaire. And then we start to get to, this idea of intrusive thought and how coupled it is with compulsive behavior. What you see is from the schizotypy item, or schizotypy scale, the items that we get are all related to your ability to control thoughts or intrusive ideas. And there's similar concepts coming up in the other questionnaires that are, again, adding to this global noise that we experience when we look at these things in isolation. So, for example, if you're answering on the trait anxiety scale, like I have disturbing thoughts as an item, this is obviously something that someone who's high in OCD is going to also endorse. Okay. So this is just kind of a flavor of the kind of things that contribute to this compulsive factor and justified to some extent our labeling of it as such. The other two factors that I'll return to this in the final section are anxious depression and social withdrawal. Those are factors 1 and 3. Okay. So we have these nice factors. These what were initially 9 different questionnaires are now condensed into these 3 trans-diagnostic factors. What are we going to do with that? Well, we can use these loadings to give everybody new scores, right? So they had scores in eating disorders, impulsivity, and OCD. We can now give them scores on these different dimensions. So we know for each individual subject how strong or how high their scores are on this compulsive factor, how high their scores are on anxious depression, and how high they are on social withdrawal. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to enter those new scores, which are derived in this data-driven way, into our behavioral analysis and then see if it does a better job than these initial concepts which separate these things out into 9 different correlated questionnaires. And we found that it did. And we found it did a remarkably good job, that this compulsive factor was stronger than any of the original questionnaire items. For example, how highly you score in OCD does a poorer job of capturing the cognitive data compared to this transdiagnostic compulsive factor. And again, we find strong evidence for the specificity of this relationship, stronger than before, because we've now significantly reduced the correlation across these different dimensions. And you can see that there's no effects of anxious depression or social withdrawal. We can talk about this later. When you control for these things together, there's even a significant tendency for social withdrawal to be a little better at model-based planning, but that's kind of, we have to follow that up. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to summarize this piece. So what I hope you take away from this approach that I've described and the study I've described is that internet-based cognitive research is valid. Not only can we reproduce effects that we find in characterized, diagnosed patient cohorts, we can do it in a fraction of the time, and we can also get data that's of a size or of magnitude where we can start asking these new exciting questions about these transdiagnostic dimensions that would just simply be impossible to do in face-to-face research. And the example is identifying these transdiagnostic symptom dimensions. Okay. So there's one more piece. I'm just going to take a drink of water. Okay. This is not a very inspired segue. Can we use this method for something else? But I don't get time to think of anything better. But again, I think it's hopefully going to underscore some of the advantages of these methods and show you that what we've done in this study is not specific to this one particular cognitive model, and that actually this approach is quite generalizable to other settings. Okay, so I'm going to talk about anxious depression for a minute, which is the first factor that emerged from the model. I think there's a similar tour that's happening. So you get items on the apathy scale to do with a lack of motivation, the extent to which you feel useful or needed, the extent to which you're content, the extent to which you plan for the future, your job security, and if you have difficulty starting, doing things, these classic kind of anxiety, depression phenotypes, and you can see like quite strong loadings across these three different questionnaires. This one I like to throw in because I feel like I'm probably hammering this point a little hard, but you've got this item on the impulsivity scale that's an indicator of apparently how impulsive you are. It's also a profoundly strong negative indicator of how depressed you are at a given moment. And this is in the Barrett impulsivity scale, which is a ubiquitous tool. Okay. All right, so we're interested, again, in using this methodology to answer a new question in a different area. And so what we're interested in is the concept of depression and metacognition, and kind of a 40 or 50-year-old idea, which is the concept of depressive realism. And that's that depressed individuals don't show the same optimism biases as their non-depressed peers. And this was first shown in 79 by Alloway and Abramson. And what they did was, it was kind of like it's a neat experiment. They had a light bulb rigged up on a table and a button in front of it, and they had subjects press the button to try and get the light bulb to illuminate, and they would, I think they would win money if they got it to illuminate, or depending on how many times they got it to illuminate. And they had non-depressed and depressed individuals, and they had two conditions. So one is called a low density condition, and really what that means is, I forgot the critical piece of information. That's the button is not connected to anything. So you're just pressing this button and it's not rigged up to the light bulb at all. The light bulb is just coming on and off indiscriminately. So in this low reward density condition, that means the light bulb just didn't come on that often. I think it came on maybe 20% of the trials, and the rest of the time it was just sitting there not doing anything. Okay, so in that condition, when things essentially objectively aren't going very well, both depressed and non-depressed individuals rate that they're not having much control over the onset of the light bulb. However, in the condition where the light bulb's coming on a lot of the time, so I can't remember the numbers, but let's say 80% of the time, you see this massive divergence between depressed and non-depressed individuals. So that is that the depressed individuals are not subject to this, optimism bias or this, different, whatever happens to the rest of us, which is that in these situations when things are going well, we attribute it to our own skill or our own prowess in these situations. So whereas the depressed individuals don't. You can think it as being glass half full, glass half empty, and then there's people who have depression who have then like another level of rationality in the world. Okay, so we were interested in tracking this in a large online sample using a task that handles, I'm not going to go into it, but some of the limitations of these kind of designs, and allows us to measure some things that can't be done with these kind of old school tasks. And the acknowledgement really for this work goes primarily to Steve Fleming, a good friend and colleague of mine at UCL, Marion Rue and Tricia Stow, the joint first authors, and Tricia is now a postdoc or a PhD student in my lab. Okay, so what we wanted to do was use a task to examine this issue of confidence or control in a large sample and try and segregate these different clinical phenotypes in a similar way to what we did in the eLife paper. So to do that, we used a very simple dot discrimination task, where your goal was just to say which side of the screen had more dots. So you would click on the left button here. And after each trial, you would rate your confidence in your decision making. And this task, obviously it wasn't this easy on every trial, and there's quite a bit of uncertainty in carrying out this task. So we did this on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and again, we split it into two different experiments, and I'll talk through the differences between those, which were subtle. And again, the design was very similar to that eLife paper. So we had a behavioral task, we had IQ, age, and gender, which, by the way, were covariates in all the analyses I presented in the prior paper and this paper. And then we had self-report clinical scales. Okay. So, what's ingenious about the way that Steve defines and separates confidence from other kind of competing sources of information, including performance, is one thing he separates is what's called metacognitive sensitivity from your kind of baseline confidence rating. So this concept, metacognitive sensitivity, is basically how accurately you can judge your own performance. And one way you can do that is by looking at the spread of distributions of confidence over correct trials versus incorrect trials. And essentially, how far apart are those distributions is an indicator of how good you are at judging your own performance, quite simply. So someone here who has really overlapping distributions is really not that good at judging their own performance. And we measure this using their confidence. Sorry, I just came up too soon. So metacognitive bias, on the other hand, is this concept of under and overconfidence. So we don't care how overlapping the distributions are. We're just looking for the mean value along this scale. So regardless of how accurate your decisions are, where is your overall level of confidence, regardless of performance over those trials? And we can separate both of these things from your actual performance of the task, which is another source of kind of confidence in these earlier designs, depending on your favorite design. There's lots of these studies. Okay, so in the first experiment, we looked at these 6 aspects of psychopathology. Again, you can think of this as kind of, a pilot experiment. In this version of the task, which we kind of improve on in a second, we're not staircasing performance. That just means that everyone has the same challenges, and some people do better at the task and some people do worse, and there's some issues with that approach that we deal with. So that means that these bars have meaning for how good people are at the perceptual decision-making task, and the extent to which these aspects of psychopathology relate to performance at this discrimination. There is no differences. But we see some nice effects of confidence in this first task. So we see that, as you might expect from the prior literature, especially in the area of depressive realism, that we get negative associations between things like social anxiety, generalized anxiety, and depression, and your bias score, so how confident you are on average. Because we weren't doing this staircase in this task, we couldn't separate the distributions to get at this metacognitive sensitivity, so that was the justification for following on with the second experiment that could do that a bit more nicely. The other thing we did in this second study, and this is when I became involved in the project, is to try and look at these trans-diagnostic dimensions as a way of making sense of some of these data up here. So you might recognize our old friends here. These are the exact same questionnaire items that we used in the eLife paper. And what this allows us to do is to apply the factor loadings from the prior paper and to compute trans-diagnostic dimensions in this situation, even though there's not quite as big enough of a sample size to do a new factor analysis. Although if we do the factor analysis, it's actually highly correlated 0.89 or something with the one we got. Anyway, so now accuracy has no meaning. Not sure why it's plotted, but there's no associations between, so for each person's individual performance is titrated, so they're 75% correct, regardless of how good they actually are at the task. And now we can start to look at confidence and metacognitive sensitivity across these different traits that we saw previously. And what you see is indeed apathy is associated with poor performance in this metacognition task, and I should say they're both just under 500 people in each of the samples. And we get like trend level effects of social anxiety and generalized anxiety, but the depression effect doesn't replicate across this study. Too much variability within that construct. So it's kind of like, okay, you're getting the same kind of general theme across the two data, but the findings are not super. These zeros are corrected for 9 multiple comparisons, and this survives correction. This is correction, a 0.05 uncorrected. Significant, a 0.05 uncorrected. Okay, and then similarly, when we go to metacognitive accuracy, we have another kind of disappointing result. So none of these things are significant in terms of the associations between the different traits and your performance at metacognitive sensitivity. But this is to be expected if you're going to buy into what I've told you before about these issues of heterogeneity within categories and these blurrings that you get across. So for example, a disorder like schizophrenia, where you've got positive and negative symptoms, those things have been associated in opposing directions with your confidence or jumping to conclusions in various settings, with positive symptoms of schizophrenia being linked to jumping to conclusions and negative symptoms being linked to depression and underconfidence and this kind of thing. So you bundle that all together in a scale and you average it and you come out with nothing. So we wanted to see if we could track this transdiagnostically. These are the results for if you do the factor analysis with their data. The results are the same, but this is on 400 subjects, so it's a little better to use the one from our paper. But as I said, the factor analysis loadings are correlated. The correlations range from 0.89 to 0.97, so really it's quite consistent across the two. Okay, so now this is, I think, the final data slide, and this is showing now we've got everybody who has a new score in these different transdiagnostic dimensions, and these are defined independently. They were defined in a separate study altogether. Is this going to do a better job of describing cognitive performance than those individual questionnaire scores? I think you see that it profoundly does so. And again, this is like completely independent. So in terms of confidence with this bias term, you see that anxious depression is associated with significantly lower confidence across all domains. And you also reveal the strong positive association between compulsive behavior and intrusive thoughts and increased confidence in decision-making regardless of your actual performance. And then we get some, interesting, albeit not surviving the three-way multiple comparison correction, such that, the depressed subjects are less confident, but they're actually more accurate at judging when they're right and wrong. And then conversely, the same pattern or the opposite pattern is seen in the compulsive individuals, where they're more confident, but actually their accuracy is poorer. And these effects are independent and controlling for one another. Okay. So in the whole thing that I've talked about today, I think we've shown evidence that goal-directed deficits map on to a transdiagnostic dimension, and this can explain what you might see when you're studying diagnostic groups that have high comorbidity rates with one another and high variability within categories, as well as across. We've seen more recently that anxious depression is linked to low confidence and shown that this method, this transdiagnostic method, significantly outperforms using these gold standard self-report instruments that are assigned or that are associated with discrete categories. And I think that's quite a strong point. We also saw that compulsive behavior and intrusive thought is linked to higher confidence and somewhat worse metacognitive accuracy. And then I'm just going to end on this point I'm trying to hammer home that internet-based data collection really does have great potential for, in particular, psychiatry research, where we're investigating new and exciting ways to reinvent the lines that we're drawing across disorders to have a bigger impact. And it's very hard to do that in small studies. So the most valuable piece of internet-based research is that you can get large samples that you couldn't otherwise get. This allows you to, if nothing else, do appropriately powered research. You don't need, 1,400 subjects to do this kind of factor analysis, but for any question you're asking, you can very easily and rapidly get a sample that's sufficient to find your effect. And that's not trivial. That's been a problem in the field. Very fast turnaround and low cost. I'm going to say it again, 1,410 days. It's astounding. It's very easy to include replication, right? So you can do discovery science, proper discovery science, and then replicate it in another study and publish that, which is just, prohibitively difficult in the kind of designs that we've been doing for so long that take forever. And then there's all these other exciting opportunities that my lab is pursuing, including longitudinal predictive research using machine learning, again, things that just require large samples, and, you know, incredible resources historically to achieve, and we can do them very easily now in the modern day. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. I just want to thank, you know, my new lab at Trinity College Dublin, some colleagues there, my PhD work at University of Cambridge, particularly Trevor, New York University with Nathaniel and Liz for my postdoc. I have 2 positions in Ireland. It's really fun over there. It's Guinness and, you know, I don't know what else, but it's great. So if you're interested, please do get in touch about those, and thank you again. Yeah, it's a great point, and there's obviously limitations to every sampling you know, method that we use. You hit the nail on the head with socially anxious. So so in terms of depression scores, anxiety, OCD, we get prevalence rates, or we can infer prevalence rates that are similar to the general population. For social anxiety, the rate in that population is 7 times larger than the general population. 7 times larger. So if you're interested in social anxiety disorders, this is a great way to get a sample of people who are highly anxious. And again, it does make sense. These are people who choose to work a certain way. You'd be surprised, they're not as, there's papers on this, I don't know the numbers offhand. Shapiro et al. Has a really good paper in clinical psychological science, and they, you know, talk about the different income brackets and all these things. They're more employed and wealthier than you would imagine, but certainly less so than the general population. It is a way to get extra cash for some people in those settings. I'm trying to think of other interesting facets of the population. You get young and old, you really can, and again, by virtue of the sample size, you can really target it into pretty select populations and get decent samples. They now have tools as well where you don't have to take, I think it's nice to take everybody who signs up, but if you really want to focus your resources, you can select for specific, age brackets, gender brackets, but also initial scores on self-report checklists if you want people high in certain symptoms and that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. So in that same Shapiro paper, they actually included a malingering questionnaire, and it was a slight problem. It could have been 5% of the population, so it's not nothing. In our paper, what we did was we included a trap question, where subjects, if they, it was like click here if you're paying attention, this kind of thing. And it was 7 out of 1,400 that fell for that. So it was extremely low in this population. There are other things that we did to ensure data quality. One that turned out to be really crucial was including like a quiz at the end of the instructions for the task that would kind of loop you back to the beginning if you weren't paying attention and were just clicking through. So I think by virtue of having that as an initial blockade, everybody who'd gone to that point had read the instructions and gone to that trouble, and then they were I would assume, we weeded out the people who were just trying to click through and might respond randomly. And I think the biggest, argument, so there will be some malingering, and there will be some people not paying attention, people losing attention, all these things. But by having a sample that's large enough and assuming these things are noise, which is an assumption, but I think it's a reasonable assumption in lots of cases, you can handle that increase in noise by having the larger sample. So I think by far, it cancels out any of that.
Claire, if I could go back to the first part of the talk where you showed the fMRI imaging, the relationship, if I remember correctly, was actually an increase in quantitative activity with less goal-directed learning, which is the opposite of what I would have naively expected. So I was wondering if you could say a little more about how you think of that relationship.
It's a great point. So, I mean, that is kind of a complicated study. So the way we did that was, obviously, we weren't just correlating people who had habits activity while they were behaving to people who weren't behaving. What we did was we used their habitual behavior as an index and then overlaid it at a similar time point when people were actively responding for the valued stimulus. So behavior was controlled, but we knew who had a habit and who didn't for that stimulus at a given moment. So that kind of, whatever, handle that particular issue. But your point is great, and we don't have a good answer for it. Whatever happened, we weren't going to it wasn't going to make sense, because in OCD, the phenomenology at the biological level is hyperactivity. So what you see is, again, at rest, hyperactivity in the caudate, and it's exacerbated by provocation and gets better with treatment response. But you're right that the simple view is that, and if you cut out the caudate, rats are habitual, right? And then, in the imaging studies, there's certainly less on the habit, but certainly lots on the goal-directed that indicate higher activity linked to higher goal-directed planning. So the way we think about it is again, not that sophisticated. It can't be, because these are kind of like very blunt and crude designs. But that, this hyperactivity, this excessive activation in OCD is maladaptive. And we don't know where it's going. We don't know where these connections are in this particular paradigm. We did a little bit of that, but, we couldn't really get a handle on and I think it's a question perhaps better approached in animal studies, where you can really get at these causal effects. But so all we can say is that it maps the biological phenomenology of OCD, which is good, and most functional tasks in OCD don't necessarily. But that is a mystery still. Yeah, in this case it was the head of the caudate, but we used the statistics, and all the results are a mask of the entire caudate. But you can see from the graphs in the paper that it's mostly the head of the caudate. I mean, in terms of the cross-species translation, I guess so. I mean, part of this is that a lot of the work in rodents is built on devaluation paradigms, which aren't measuring goal-directed control cleanly from the buildup of habits. Okay. Okay. So you think you can cleanly dissociate the buildup of the habit from because they're competing in most paradigms that I'm aware of. So that's the same kind of limitation. I'm going to digress here. You can say the same thing is happening, right? In devaluation, they're competing. You don't know which one's driving it. We've done a lot of work looking at how to isolate the contribution of the buildup of habits to devaluation in humans, and there's none that we can assess. So we think that paradigm in humans is really just focusing on, or really just tapping goal-directed processing, and that the signal, if any, for the buildup of stimulus response associations and the potential for that to be driving our effects is non-existent in several studies that we've done. Anyway, we can talk about that later.
Trans-diagnostic dementia, SSRIs treat all the same trans-diagnostic and that's why there's always residual suffering left over, because we're not treating those other trans-diagnostic.
Yeah.
Maybe when you're a little bit, you had data at all about how much of the variance, let's say, in functional impairment is accounted for by those three factors, or what happens if you start adding in other factors, overall suffering kind of factor getting the point you started with?
Yeah. It's a great question. It's something that in these studies, we unfortunately didn't measure that kind of real world impact and functional impairment, social impairment, work impairment, et cetera. But we're doing that now in studies that are essentially addressing the question that you've posed, which is, can these transdiagnostic dimensions make predictions about what kind of treatment response you should choose? And because we're doing that so we have a study that we're setting up now where we're going to follow 1,000 people from across the English-speaking world as they go through a course of antidepressants, and use machine learning methods to make, predictions about who's going to respond. As an outcome measure, and when we're all thinking about these transdiagnostic dimensions, we're looking at the work and social adjustment scale. It's trans-diagnostic. It is clinically meaningful. It is the thing that people want to get better as a result of treatment, regardless of what specific disorder you have. So, I don't have an answer for it yet, but you're exactly on this. We're thinking the same way about where this hopefully can go in terms of starting to make an impact. And, the other thing I've talked about colleagues this morning is that, this approach I think is interesting, and it helps us maybe understand these mechanisms and the effects that we've seen across disorders previously. But there's still plenty of potential for it to fail to translate to any of these clinically meaningful outcomes, predictions about course or about treatment selection. So I think it's important that we start taking this next step to really focus on understanding the mechanisms of treatment response, on optimizing our phenotypes for clinically valuable insights, such as what treatment's best for what person. It's true, and you're right, there's no good solution. So all these studies were done on extinction, including the avoidance paradigm, but it's not as satisfying. And the case of avoidance is an incredibly complex one in general, for psychologists to get a handle on. So we have no good answer, but, the question I'm focused on is, the extent to which we can measure goal-directed planning, and one, I suppose, defense of the paradigm, however contrived it was, is that we get the same findings that we do in appetitive paradigms in terms of the association across disorders. Maybe, I know that's not the most satisfying answer in the world, but it gets to the core of what we're trying to do with this task. But you're right. I mean, looking at avoidance in these, it hadn't been done before. I don't think we did it perfectly, but I think we tapped into the signal that we wanted to tap into, however noisily. To your former question, I think there are obvious parallels across the two kind of, the two concepts. I think ours is a little more specific because I designed it right, so it's not an exhaustive list. We designed it to answer this question about generalizability and specificity. If we opened it up more broadly, I expect we'd end up with, if we throw the whole mental health space in there, I imagine we'd end up with something quite similar. Whether it's going to map onto biology as well as this did, I don't know the answer to that. In terms of whether we're getting truly sick people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which I think was the second question, the answer is that we are, and we're getting people who are really incredibly ill on all of the different measurements that we have. Another, finding from these data is what we're finding are continuous relationships across the population. So of those individuals who are incredibly ill, who are in the top quartile, let's say, of the symptoms, we get the same association between their symptom severity and the performance on the task as we do in all of the other quartiles in this population. So yeah, and if anything, I think it's a better way to get. I mean, it's not better than being attached to a clinic, but it's faster, and it's better than being, just recruiting from general websites or whatever, because a lot of these people are too sick to travel, right? Or too sick to come in for university study, or don't want to put themselves through that, particularly socially anxious folks. So it's a really great way to get access to that population who would not sign up to come into a psychology experiment and sit through something as weird as these paradigms they have people sit through.
Well, thank you very much. very much for a great talk. Yeah, great conversation too. Thanks.
Okay.
You have been